Let me tell you about a man named John who worked the night shift at a lonely gas station on the outskirts of town. The job was uneventful, providing him with plenty of time to read and reflect in the quiet hours of the night. But one fateful night, John experienced something that would haunt him forever. The night began like any other. John arrived at the gas station at 10 p.m., greeted by the flickering neon lights and the hum of the old refrigerator. He settled into his routine, checking the stock, refilling the coffee machine, and arranging the snacks on the shelves. The occasional customer would come by to fill up their tank or grab a quick snack, but for the most part, the station remained eerily quiet. Around midnight, John stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was unusually still, with no sounds of crickets or distant traffic. He leaned against the wall, staring up at the sky, when he noticed a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. The car seemed to be moving slowly, almost deliberately, as if the driver was unsure of their destination. As the car pulled into the station, John felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The vehicle was an old, rusted sedan, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't see inside. The car rolled to a stop in front of one of the pumps, but no one got out. John waited a moment, then cautiously approached the driver's side window. He tapped on the glass and asked if the driver needed any help. There was no response. He tapped again, harder this time, and leaned in closer. The window slowly rolled down, revealing an empty interior. The driver's seat was vacant, the steering wheel unmanned. Confused and unsettled, John stepped back, looking around for any sign of the driver. Suddenly, the car's engine roared to life, and the headlights flared blindingly bright. John stumbled back, shielding his eyes, as the car abruptly reversed and sped off into the night, leaving behind the acrid smell of burning rubber. He stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Shaken, John returned to the gas station, locking the door behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the memory of the empty car fresh in his mind. He sat behind the counter, trying to focus on his book, but every creak and groan of the building made him jump. Around 2 a.m., the gas station's lights began to flicker. John looked up, frowning as the lights dimmed and brightened erratically. He got up to check the circuit breaker in the back room, but just as he reached it, the lights went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. John fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick blackness. As he made his way back to the front, he heard a noise that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of a car engine idling just outside the station. He crept to the window and peered out, his heart nearly stopping when he saw the same rusted sedan parked by the pumps, its headlights off but engine running. The front door creaked open slowly, and a cold breeze swept through the station. John backed away, flashlight shaking in his hand. The door swung wide, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadowy figure standing just outside, barely visible in the dim light. The figure seemed to be watching him, its presence heavy and oppressive. Terrified, John ducked behind the counter, his mind racing. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, echoing eerily in the stillness. He held his breath, praying the figure would go away, but the footsteps continued, stopping just on the other side of the counter. John felt a cold hand brush against his arm, and he jumped, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam illuminated nothing but empty space. He scrambled to his feet and ran for the back rooms, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. He pressed his ear to the door, listening intently, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The room grew colder, and John could see his breath misting in the air. He backed away from the door, eyes darting around the small space. Suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening bang, and the flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in complete darkness. He heard the footsteps again, now inside the room with him. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. John pressed himself against the wall, trying to remain silent, but the fear was overwhelming. He felt a cold breath on his neck, and a voice whispered his name, sending a jolt of terror through him. In a desperate bid for survival, John lunged for the door, flinging it open and sprinting back into the main area of the gas station. The lights flickered back on, and he could see the rusted sedan speeding away once more, disappearing into the night. The oppressive presence lifted, and the gas station was eerily silent again. John collapsed behind the counter, shaking uncontrollably. He stayed there until dawn, too terrified to move. When his shift ended, he handed in his resignation, vowing never to return to the gas station. The experience left him scared, a haunting reminder of the night he encountered the phantom car and the dark, malevolent presence that had come with it. The three people, Michael, David, and Olivia, were on a road trip, exploring the countryside and enjoying the scenic beauty. They had planned this trip for months, hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. One evening, as the sun began to set, they found themselves lost in a dense forest. The GPS had stopped working, and the narrow, winding roads seemed to go on forever. As darkness fell, they grew increasingly anxious. The forest was eerily silent, and their car's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled in. Just as panic was beginning to set in, they spotted a dim light in the distance. Michael, who was driving, steered the car toward the light, hoping it was a gas station where they could ask for directions. Relief washed over them as they pulled into the gas station. It was an old, dilapidated building with a flickering neon sign that read "Open." The place seemed deserted, but they had no other options. Michael parked the car, and they all got out, stretching their legs and trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them. As they approached the entrance, Olivia hesitated. She felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down her spine. She shrugged it off, attributing it to the cold night air, and followed Michael and David inside. The interior of the gas station was dimly lit, with dusty shelves lined with old snacks and supplies. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on them as they entered. Michael greeted the old man and asked for directions. The old man gave them a strange look before nodding and pointing to a map on the wall. As Michael and David studied the map, Olivia wandered around the store, her unease growing with each step. She felt as though she was being watched, but every time she looked around, there was no one there. Suddenly, Olivia felt a sharp pain in her head and stumbled. She grabbed a shelf for support, knocking over a few items. Michael and David rushed to her side, helping her back to her feet. The old man watched them with an unsettling intensity, his eyes never leaving Olivia. As they prepared to leave, Olivia's condition worsened. She felt dizzy and disoriented, and her vision began to blur. Michael and David decided it was best to get her back to the car and find a hospital. They thanked the old man and hurried out of the gas station. Once inside the car, Olivia's condition continued to deteriorate. She started muttering incoherently, her eyes wide with fear. Michael and David exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. As they drove away from the gas station, the car's engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded on the side of the road. Michael tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The fog seemed to grow thicker, enveloping the car and obscuring their surroundings. Suddenly, Olivia let out a blood-curdling scream. She pointed at the rearview mirror, her face pale with terror. Michael and David turned to see what had frightened her, but there was nothing there. Olivia's screams grew louder, and she began thrashing in her seat. Michael and David tried to calm her down, but it was as if she was possessed by some unseen force. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and their breaths came out in visible puffs. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, making it impossible to see anything beyond. As Olivia's thrashing became more violent, the car doors suddenly locked, trapping them inside. The radio crackled to life, emitting a low, eerie static. Michael and David felt a cold presence in the car, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. They knew they were not alone. The static on the radio grew louder, and they could make out faint whispers in the noise. Olivia's eyes rolled back in her head, and she began speaking in a voice that was not her own. The words were guttural and unintelligible, sending chills down Michael and David's spines. The cold presence seemed to grow stronger, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Desperate to escape, Michael and David tried to force the car doors open, but they wouldn't budge. The whispers on the radio grew louder, and Olivia's voice became more frantic. She clawed at her seatbelt, her eyes wide with terror. The cold presence in the car was almost suffocating, and they could feel it tightening around them. In a final act of desperation, Michael grabbed a tire iron from the back seat and smashed the window. The glass shattered, and the cold air rushed in, breaking the oppressive hold of the presence. They dragged Olivia out of the car, her body limp and unresponsive. As they stumbled away from the car, the fog began to lift, and they could see the faint outline of the gas station in the distance. The old man stood outside, watching them with a sinister smile. They realized that they had been lured into a trap, and the gas station was the source of the malevolent force that had taken hold of Olivia. With no other options, they carried Olivia back to the gas station, hoping to confront the old man and find a way to break the curse. As they approached, the old man's smile widened, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The gas station lights flickered, and they could hear the whispers growing louder. Michael and David demanded to know what the old man had done to Olivia, but he remained silent, his eyes gleaming with malice. They felt the cold presence closing in around them again, and the whispers became deafening. The old man raised his hand, and Olivia's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back in her head. In a desperate attempt to save her, Michael lunged at the old man, but his hand passed through him as if he were a ghost. The old man let out a chilling laugh, and the ground beneath them split open, revealing a dark, swirling void. Michael and David clung to Olivia, trying to pull her back, but the void seemed to pull her in with an irresistible force. The old man's laughter echoed around them as the void closed, leaving them standing in the empty gas station. Olivia was gone, and the whispers had stopped. Michael and David were left with a feeling of profound emptiness, knowing they had lost her to something beyond their understanding. They stumbled back to the car, the cold presence still lingering around them. They knew they had to leave the forest and never return. As they drove away, the gas station disappeared into the fog, leaving them with the haunting memory of the night they encountered the gas station of shadows and the dark force that had taken Olivia. This story belongs from James, who was on a long road trip, driving through the desolate countryside late at night. He had been on the road for hours and was beginning to feel the fatigue set in. His stomach rolled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in a while. To make matters worse, the fuel gauge on his car was hovering just above empty. He needed to find a gas station soon. As he continued driving, he saw a dim light in the distance. Relieved, he steered his car toward it, hoping it was a gas station. As he got closer, he could make out the faint glow of neon lights. It was indeed a gas station, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. He pulled in and parked next to one of the pumps. The gas station looked old and run down. The flickering neon sign above the entrance read "Open 24 hours," but the place seemed deserted. James got out of his car and started fueling up. The air was chilly, and the silence was unsettling. As he waited for the tank to fill, he looked around and noticed an old man sitting behind the counter inside the station. Once the tank was full, James went inside to pay. The old man behind the counter gave him a slow, deliberate nod. James felt a shiver run down his spine, but tried to shake off the feeling. He was starving, and his main concern was finding something to eat. James asked the old man if they had any food. The old man pointed to a dusty, dimly lit corner of the store where a small selection of snacks was displayed. James walked over and grabbed a sandwich that looked somewhat fresh. As he was about to pay, the old man spoke in a raspy voice, warning him that the sandwich was the last one they had for the night. And the sandwich. He sat down at a small table in the corner of the gas station to eat. As he unwrapped the sandwich, he noticed a strange smell, but his hunger overrode his caution. He took a bite and immediately regretted it. The sandwich tasted off, like it had been sitting out for far too long. Feeling nauseous, James decided to leave. He stood up, but his legs felt weak and his vision blurred. Panic set in as he realized something was very wrong. He stumbled toward the door, but his body felt heavy and unresponsive. The old man behind the counter watched him with a sinister smile. James collapsed to the floor, his consciousness fading. As he lay there, he heard the old man's footsteps approaching. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the old man standing over him, his eyes gleaming with malevolence. When James regained consciousness, he found himself in a dimly lit room. His hands and feet were bound, and the room smelled of decay. Fear surged through him as he realized he had been taken captive. He struggled against the ropes, but they were tied tightly. The door creaked open, and the old man entered, carrying a tray with a strange, foul-smelling liquid. He set the tray down and stared at James with cold, empty eyes. James demanded to know what was happening, but the old man remained silent, his expression unreadable. Without warning, the old man forced the liquid down James's throat. It burned as it went down, and James choked and gagged, his body convulsing. The old man watched with a twisted satisfaction, his lips curling into a cruel smile. James's vision began to blur again, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He knew he had to escape, but his body was growing weaker by the second. Summoning all his strength, he managed to break free of the ropes and staggered toward the door. He stumbled through the darkened halls of the gas station, the old man's laughter echoing behind him. Every corner he turned seemed to lead him deeper into a maze of horror. He finally found a door that led outside and burst through it, gasping for fresh air. James ran to his car, fumbling with the keys. He could still hear the old man's laughter, growing louder and more maniacal. He finally got the car started and sped away from the gas station, not daring to look back. As he drove, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man following him. The road ahead was dark and winding, and his vision was still blurry from whatever the old man had forced him to drink. But he couldn't stop. He had to get as far away as possible. Hours passed, and James finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. He pulled into a parking lot and collapsed in his seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He knew he needed help, but he was too weak to move. A passerby noticed him and called for an ambulance. James was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize him. They found traces of a potent hallucinogen in his system and told him he was lucky to be alive. As James recovered, he recounted his ordeal to the police. They investigated the gas station but found no trace of the old man or any signs of the horrific events James described. The gas station appeared abandoned, with no indication that anyone had been there for years. James knew what he had experienced was real, even if there was no evidence to prove it. The memory of the old man's malevolent smile and the taste of the foul liquid haunted his dreams. He vowed never to take another road trip alone and to always be cautious of where he stopped for fuel. The gas station became a legend in the small town, a place where strange and terrifying things happened to those who were unlucky enough to stop there. And though James tried to move on with his life, he could never forget the night he encountered the gas station of shadows and the horrific moment that nearly cost him his life. Ava and her boyfriend, Robert, were on a late-night drive to visit her parents. The journey was long, and they were eager to reach their destination. As they drove through the quiet, dark roads, Robert realized the fuel gauge was nearing empty. They needed to find a gas station soon. After a few more miles, they spotted a small gas station, illuminated by a flickering neon sign. Robert pulled in and started fueling the car. Once the tank was full, he reached into his pocket for his wallet, but his face fell when he realized it wasn't there. He had forgotten it at home. Panicking slightly, Robert turned to Ava and explained the situation. They didn't have enough cash to pay for the fuel. Robert decided to drive back home to get his wallet. He asked Ava to stay at the gas station while he made the quick trip back. She reluctantly agreed, feeling a bit uneasy about being left alone at such an isolated place. As Robert drove away, the gas station suddenly felt much colder and lonelier. Ava stood near the entrance, glancing around at the empty pumps and the dark surroundings. She tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling herself it was just her imagination. Minutes passed slowly. Ava decided to go inside the gas station store to pass the time. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves stocked with old snacks and dusty supplies. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes following her every move. She tried to ignore him and wandered through the aisles, looking for something to distract her from the growing sense of dread. Ava picked up a magazine and sat down on a small bench near the entrance. She kept glancing at the clock, wondering how long Robert would take. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours. She felt a chill run down her spine and looked up to see the old man staring at her intently. His gaze was unsettling, and she decided to move closer to the door. As she waited, Ava noticed a figure standing by one of the pumps outside. It was hard to see clearly in the dim light, but the figure seemed to be watching her. She felt a surge of fear and looked away, hoping it was just a trick of the light. When she glanced back, the figure was gone. The door creaked open, and Ava jumped, her heart racing. It was just the wind, she told herself. She tried to calm down, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. She decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping it would help her feel better. Outside, the cold air hit her, making her shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself and paced near the entrance, keeping a wary eye on her surroundings. The gas station was eerily silent, with only the faint hum of the lights and the occasional rustling of leaves breaking the stillness. Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she quickly pulled it out, hoping it was Robert. It was a message from him, saying he was on his way back and would be there soon. She sighed with relief, but couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Ava turned around but saw no one. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty station. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The old man appeared in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. He slowly walked toward her, his expression unreadable. Ava's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Just as the old man reached out to her, a car's headlights pierced the darkness. It was Robert, finally back with his wallet. He jumped out of the car and ran toward Ava, shouting her name. The old man stepped back, his face twisted in anger. Robert reached Ava and grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the car. They both jumped in, and Robert sped away from the gas station, his eyes wide with fear. Ava glanced back and saw the old man standing in the middle of the road, his eyes following them as they disappeared into the night. Once they were a safe distance away, Robert asked Ava what had happened. She told him everything, her voice trembling with fear. Robert held her hand tightly, assuring her that they were safe now. As they drove, Ava couldn't shake off the feeling that they were still being watched. The memory of the old man's eyes and the eerie silence of the gas station haunted her thoughts. She knew she would never forget that night and the horrific moment she faced alone. When they finally reached her parents' house, Ava felt a sense of relief wash over her. She hugged her parents tightly, grateful to be safe. But the experience had left a mark on her, and she knew she would always be wary of isolated gas stations in the middle of the night. As they settled into bed that night, Ava couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. She knew that the old man and the gas station would forever be etched in her mind, a chilling reminder of the night she faced true terror.